The German invasion of Poland at dawn on the 1st of September 1939 finally dashed hopes that the conflict of 1914-18 had been the war to end all war. Attempts to maintain peace through disarmament had failed. The League of Nations had shown itself powerless to act against aggression in Abyssinia and China. The policy of appeasing Hitler had been in vain. Poland was indeed the funeral pyre of all efforts to prevent war. Within 2 days of the German attack, France and Britain had honored their pledge to Poland by declaring war against Germany. But this did not halt the German invasion. There was none of the euphoria, even in Berlin, that had greeted war in August 1914. Not just because of memories of the carnage of the Great War, but also on account of the widely held belief that war would now be mainly characterized by vast air fleets attacking cities. Hitler saw war as the only way to overcome Polish intransigence, Britain and France as a last resort to curb his ambitions. Hitler's ally Mussolini was not ready for war, and for the time being was content to remain a spectator. Stalin, having signed a non-aggression pact with Hitler on the eve of war, and in the face of Anglo-French attempts to form an alliance with Russia like that of 1914, prepared to grab eastern Poland, but only once the Germans had largely destroyed the Polish armed forces. America, as she had done in 1914, maintained her policy of isolationism, with Roosevelt declaring her neutrality. Germany's greatest fear had always been simultaneous war on two fronts, east and west. Unlike in 1914, Hitler did not face the threat of a Russian invasion. Nevertheless, Poland must be overrun quickly if he was to be able to counter any Anglo-French attack from the west. To do this, the German armed forces had developed during the 1930s a new concept of war, Blitzkrieg, or lightning war. Blitzkrieg's two essential ingredients were the panzer divisions of fast-moving tanks closely combined with air power, especially the Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bomber. The Stukas were used as aerial artillery and would help the tanks to break through swiftly and surround large pockets of enemy forces. These pockets would be reduced by the infantry following up behind, but these were still largely reliant on their feet, as they had been in 1914, and there was always the danger that the panzers would get too far ahead of them. Poland had a major problem in that she had long borders to defend. There was the German border in the west, but also those with East Prussia in the north. Finally, there was a new threat since March 1939 from German forces in Slovakia. While the Poles could match the Germans in manpower and did not lack courage, their armed forces were relatively backward in equipment. What few modern weapons they had were largely obsolescent. In the opening minutes of the German attack, the battleship Schleswig-Holstein began to shell the Polish fortress of Westerplatte in Danzig harbor. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe attacked airfields to destroy as many Polish aircraft as possible on the ground. In an effort to turn back the swarms of German aircraft, the Polish Air Force tried to fight them in the air, but the cost was high. Luftwaffe bombers attacked communications, bridges, and troop concentrations. The Polish people quickly discovered the horrific character of modern war. The German panzers rapidly broke through the Polish defenses, trapping large numbers of Polish troops. Follow-up infantry reduced these pockets while the panzers pressed on. The pockets yielded thousands of dazed Polish prisoners. Yet the Poles continued to fight, mounting counterattacks when and where they could. In desperation, they sent the flower of their army, the cavalry, in suicidal charges against the German tanks. The Poles could not stop the Germans reaching the river Vistula and the outskirts of Warsaw, their capital, on the 15th day of the war. Polish hopes now rested on an Anglo-French blow against Germany from the west. True, the French did make a small advance into the Saarland. They were not, however, prepared to advance beyond the range of the guns in the Maginot Line. The first German attempts to break into Warsaw failed, for the Poles were determined to defend their capital and refused to surrender it. Consequently, the Germans decided to send in the Luftwaffe. So the citizens of Warsaw now went through the same experience as those of Madrid and Guernica in Spain and Shanghai and Nanking in China. But still, Warsaw held out. By the 17th of September, the Germans had cleared the Polish corridor. Thrusts south from East Prussia and eastwards from Germany had totally cut off Warsaw, while a further attack from Slovakia was overrunning southern Poland. But on this same day, the 17th, the Russians suddenly invaded from the east on a broad front. Poland's last hopes of salvation had vanished. With the Poles so tied down by the German onslaught, the Russian advance was deceptively swift, bearing in mind that Stalin had purged the cream of the senior officer corps. The German forces continued to advance eastwards. 2 days later, they met the advancing Russians at Brest-Litovsk, scene of the March 1918 peace treaty between the two countries. The Germans and Russians now set about clearing the remaining pockets of Polish resistance. Still, the Poles fought on. Warsaw remained besieged, in spite of surrender leaflets dropped from the air. The Luftwaffe's pounding continued. Eventually, all of the city's public utilities were destroyed, and the river Vistula was the only source of water. To prevent further civilian suffering, the garrison surrendered on the 27th of September, and German troops entered in triumph. Some Polish soldiers managed to escape and eventually made their way to France to form a new army. General Władysław Sikorski also formed a government in exile in Paris. In Poland itself, the last resistance ceased on the 5th of October 1939. Poland's 20 years of independence were at an end. She was now partitioned. The Germans took the western part of the country, the Russians the east. In western Poland, the Nazi jackboot soon made itself felt. The fate of many of the Poles captured by the Russians only began to be revealed in 1943, when the Germans discovered the mass grave of 4,000 Polish officers at Katyn in western Russia. Not until more than 45 years later would the Russians own up to this crime. With Poland destroyed, Hitler now turned westwards, redeploying the bulk of his armies and ordering them to prepare an attack on Holland, Belgium and northern France for mid-November. Britain and France had done little to help Poland. Indeed, the French withdrew their troops from the Saarland back into the Maginot Line as soon as Poland had fallen. The truth was that the vast amount of money that the French had invested in the Maginot Line had committed them to a policy of defense and had dampened all offensive spirit. Likewise, the British were wary of committing a large army to the continent of Europe, as they had found themselves doing 25 years earlier, and lacked the equipment to be able to do so. Nonetheless, as in 1914, they did send 4 divisions across the English Channel. The Allies were confident that the Maginot Line would deter the Germans from attacking across their border with France. Their reaction to a German attack through the Low Countries would be an advance to the River Dyle in Belgium, since northern France lacked suitable obstacles on which to base a defense. In the meantime, the Allies began to extend the Maginot Line northwards from Luxembourg. This was all they could do, since Belgian neutrality prevented them from inspecting the Dyle Line, let alone preparing defences on it. It was therefore merely a time of waiting for a German attack which appeared increasingly remote as winter gripped the Western Front. Soon this period became known as the Blitzkrieg, or Phony War. In London and Paris, they waited for the massed air onslaught that had engulfed Warsaw. In Britain, children were evacuated from the cities to the safer rural areas. All civilians had to carry gas masks, through fears that the Luftwaffe might use this weapon on a massive scale. But the air forces on both sides were very conscious that attacks on civilian targets might well bring retaliation in kind. Thus, the Royal Air Force's early operations were merely daylight attacks on German warships. They met with little success, and a significant proportion of aircraft were shot down. The RAF therefore switched to dropping leaflets on Germany by night. The winter of 1939-40 was severe and put a further brake on air operations. It was only at sea that there was significant activity. From the outset, it became clear that unlike in 1914, submarine warfare would be unrestricted. On the opening day of the war in the West, the 3rd of September, a German U-boat sank the liner Athenia in the North Atlantic, with the loss of 112 lives, including 26 American citizens. The British immediately instituted convoying and declared a total blockade of Germany. Convoying took time to organize, however, and the Royal Navy had a grave shortage of escort vessels. Consequently, before the year was out, the U-boats, 57 of which were operational at the outbreak of war, had sunk over 100 ships, but mainly vessels sailing on their own. Also among their victims was the British aircraft carrier Courageous. Most audacious of all was the sinking of the battleship Royal Oak at the Home Fleet's wartime anchorage at Scapa Flow in the Orkneys. Günther Prien, the U-boat skipper, became an overnight hero in Germany. With his relatively small U-boat force, Hitler was resolved to use his modern surface fleet to attack British trade. This had been given construction priority over U-boats. One ship, the Graf Spee, had sailed from Germany before the outbreak of war and now began to harry British shipping in the South Atlantic and Indian Oceans, leaving a trail of sunk vessels in her wake. The British formed a number of task forces to hunt her down. She was eventually located by 3 cruisers operating from the Falkland Islands. On the 13th of December, they fought her off the Argentine coast near the mouth of the River Plate. Although outgunned, the British ships forced her to seek refuge in neutral Montevideo harbour. Captain Hans Langsdorff, believing that a larger force had now arrived and was waiting for him at the mouth of the Plate, scuttled his ship rather than allow her to be sunk by his enemies. A few days later, he committed suicide. This was just about the only positive success that French and British arms enjoyed in 1939, and the crews of 2 of the British ships, Exeter and Ajax, were fated as heroes on their return to Britain. Anglo-French attention was also turned to Scandinavia before the year was out. Stalin feared that his small northern neighbour, Finland, which had thrown off the yoke of Russian rule in 1919, would allow German forces in. This posed a threat to Leningrad, as Petrograd was now called, and also jeopardized the vital Arctic port of Murmansk. He therefore demanded of the Finns an exchange of territory, offering them a desolate region in return for areas which would secure Murmansk and Leningrad. The Finns refused, and on the 30th of November 1939, Stalin's forces attacked them. Given Finland's massive numerical inferiority in manpower and her lack of modern weapons, it should have been an easy Russian victory. Yet the Finns held out, inflicting very heavy casualties. Stalin's purges had so ravaged the senior ranks of the Soviet armed forces that they were now commanded by inexperienced officers. Semyon Timoshenko, one of the few senior officers to survive the purges, now took charge and attacked again in February 1940. His offensive and Russian air attacks soon began to tell. In early March, the Finns sued for peace and were forced to surrender the territory marked in blue that the Russians had originally demanded. The result was a mass exodus of Finns from the ceded regions. The Western Allies had wanted to help the Finns by passing troops through Narvik in neutral Norway. Swedish iron ore bound for Germany also passed through this port. The German Navy was also attracted by Norway's fjords as bases for its operations against Britain. Hitler therefore ordered invasion plans to be drawn up. On the 16th of February 1940, the British destroyer Cossack entered a Norwegian fjord and rescued seamen captured by the Graf Spee from the prison ship Altmark, which had taken refuge there. This accelerated German planning, and on the 6th of April, their invasion fleet set sail to preempt any Allied occupation of Norway. It was spotted by an RAF aircraft next day, and the British home fleet left port, but a gale prevented interception. On the 8th of April, German troops began to land at points on the Norwegian coast, including Narvik. Other forces landed in the Oslo fjord, and paratroops were used to secure Stavanger airfield. The ill-prepared and weak Norwegian forces could do little in the face of all these simultaneous attacks. At the same time, Denmark, totally taken by surprise, was invaded and quickly forced to surrender. On the 10th and 12th, British destroyers entered Narvik fjord to attack German warships. They sank a total of 9 German destroyers at a cost of 2 of their own. Air attacks were also mounted. These attacks virtually isolated the German ground force at Narvik. Hastily cobbled together Allied land forces now also landed on the Norwegian coast. In the meantime, the Germans had entered Oslo and began to advance northwards to link up their landings. The Germans enjoyed air superiority, and this enabled them to isolate the Allied landings and force them to evacuate their beachheads one by one. The only eventual Allied success was to recapture Narvik, but at the beginning of June 1940, they were forced to evacuate even this. Once more, German arms had been triumphant, but by June 1940, even more spectacular events had been taking place hundreds of miles to the south. To Hitler, Norway was a mere distraction from his main aim of overrunning the Low Countries and northern France, so as to provide air and sea bases from which to threaten Britain. The Allies believed, as the winter of 1939-40 wore on, that possibly the Germans were having second thoughts about invading the West. Certainly the severe weather had forced delays, as had a likely compromise of the plan when a German aircraft forced landed in Belgium in January 1940. Now that spring had arrived, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain even went so far as to state that Hitler had missed the bus. In truth, there had been a major debate in the German camp over how the attack should be executed. The German army in the West was organized into 3 army groups. The original plan called for Fedor von Bock's Army Group B in the north, with the bulk of the tanks, to make the main effort into Holland and Belgium and then sweep down the coast. With Gerd von Rundstedt's Army Group A supporting him on the southern flank. Wilhelm von Lieb's smaller Army Group C would remain on the defensive in front of the Maginot Line. Gerd von Rundstedt, commander of Army Group A, and more especially his Chief of Staff, Erich von Manstein, objected to this plan. It was too obvious and would leave a large French army intact at the end of the operation. Rather, the main thrust should be made by their army group in the center, with the aim of cutting off the northern Allied armies. Army Group B would overrun Holland and hold the Allied attention in the north, while Army Group C retained its defensive role in front of the Maginot Line. Hitler eventually agreed to this plan in mid-March, but Norway delayed its execution. The Allied decision to rest their defense in the north on an advance to the River Dyle in neutral Belgium the moment the Germans attacked played into the hands of the von Manstein plan. The Allies also discounted as impassable to tanks the hilly and wooded Ardennes region of southern Belgium through which the main German thrust would come. The Allies also labored under other disadvantages. They might practice what they would do when the Germans did attack, but Belgian refusal to allow British and French troops across the frontier meant that they could not do this on the ground on which they intended to fight. The Allies, especially the British, had reinforced their armies during the winter, but many British divisions were ill-equipped. Communications at the higher level were poor, and Allied commander Maurice Gamelin was an academic rather than fighting general. While the Allies actually had more tanks than the Germans, some 3,300 as against almost 2,600, many, like these British Matildas, were dedicated to supporting infantry and were relatively slow-moving. The massive French Char B suffered from having a one-man turret, which meant that the occupant had to both command the tank and operate its gun at the same time. The most serious Allied weakness was that Maginot-mindedness had generated a rigidity of thought, ill-suited to coping with the highly fluid German Blitzkrieg. The German attack was finally mounted before dawn on the 10th of May. German aircraft attacked Dutch, Belgian and French air bases in order to destroy as much as possible of the Allied air forces on the ground. Shortly afterwards, the German ground forces crossed the frontiers of Holland, Belgium and Luxembourg. In the north, paratroops were used to secure vital bridges needed for the advance of von Bock's tanks. A complete division was landed on Dutch airfields and roads in order to seize other vital points. The Dutch, noting what had happened in Norway, put obstacles on runways, and this caused heavy casualties. Nevertheless, the Dutch army, with its obsolete weapons, was no match for the highly tuned German war machine, and much of the country had been overrun in just 5 days. On the 14th of May, the Germans demanded the surrender of the large port of Rotterdam. The Dutch hesitated, and immediately a large force of bombers took off to attack the city. While they were airborne, the Dutch surrendered Rotterdam. Unfortunately, the German bombers could not be stopped, and much of Rotterdam was destroyed. Once again, the air warfare prophets seem to have been vindicated. Next day, the Dutch government capitulated. As with Holland, the Germans had to face the problem in northeast Belgium of initially tackling waterways covered by guns. The key to these defenses was the fort of Eben-Emael, which was attacked by glider-borne paratroop engineers. Using hollow charge explosives and flamethrowers, they forced its surrender, much to the surprise of the Belgian High Command, who believed Eben-Emael to be impregnable. The main advance into Belgium could now get properly underway, and the Germans were soon thrusting westwards. The Belgian forces, their exhaustion growing, withdrew back towards the River Dyle. Meanwhile, the best of the French armies and the British had crossed into Belgium on the 10th of May, in order to take up their positions on the River Dyle. They met swarms of refugees coming the other way. The main German thrust through the Ardennes was spearheaded by 7 panzer divisions, which had little difficulty in brushing aside the light Allied screening forces. By the evening of the 12th, they had reached the River Meuse and began to battle with the French defences on the west bank. Next day, the Germans began to cross at several points, initially using rubber dinghies to help them to establish toeholds on the far bank. French fire was initially heavy. Nevertheless, the German assault team soon established bridgeheads on the far bank and began to build bridges to enable the armour to cross. Throughout, the German artillery pounded the French defences. Overhead, the Stukas made repeated attacks, and eventually the French broke, enabling the panzers to thrust westwards. Allied air attacks on the bridges failed, with 35 out of these British Fairy Battle light bombers being shot down in 5 days. The French now tried to use their 4 armoured divisions, one only just formed and commanded by Colonel Charles de Gaulle. These attempted to strike at the ever more exposed flanks of the panzer thrust, but their cumbersome command and control system and poor planning meant that they were sent into battle piecemeal, and the Germans had little problem in warding them off, inflicting heavy casualties. By the 15th of May, the situation was that northern Allied armies were holding firm against pressure from von Bock's army group in the north. But General Gamelin now became aware of the growing threat from von Rundstedt's panzers to the south. He therefore ordered his forces to begin to withdraw from the Dial line. This sudden order to withdraw was disillusioning for the Allied troops, who felt that they had been giving a good account of themselves. It was also bewildering for the local population. The growing flood of refugees clogged roads and made the withdrawal that much more difficult. Von Rundstedt's panzer divisions continued to sweep westwards, creating ever more confusion the deeper they penetrated. Gamelin himself was now incapable of making any decisions, and on the 19th of May was replaced by Maxime Weygand. At the same time, Marshal Henri Pétain, hero of Verdun in 1916, was made Deputy Prime Minister. Weygand tried to coordinate British and French tank attacks into the flanks of the panzer thrust. Although the British temporarily halted some German tanks, the attacks were repulsed once more. The German drive continued, but the Allied tank attacks had made the High Command nervous. This was especially since the main body of infantry was falling ever further behind. The exhaustion of the tank crews was increasing, and a temporary halt was ordered. But General Heinz Guderian, one of the prime architects of Blitzkrieg, was determined to allow the Allies no respite, and pressed on once more. 20th of May, his tanks reached the Channel coast, at the mouth of the Somme. The northern Allied armies fighting their way back were now cut off. Guderian advanced north and seized the port of Boulogne before going on to attack Calais. Here, a hastily organized British brigade had just arrived from England to reinforce the French defenders. The reinforced garrison put up stiff resistance, and there was fierce fighting for 2 days. Eventually, German superior strength told, and the defenders were forced to surrender. This left the northern Allied armies with the German noose even tighter around their necks. They were totally cut off from the French armies in the Maginot Line and south of the River Somme. The Belgians, their country almost totally overrun, now sought an armistice, considering that further resistance was useless. On the 27th of May, they surrendered. The vacuum created by the surrender forced the British and French into an even smaller perimeter. Meanwhile, Lord Gort, the British commander, had decided that the evacuation of his force to England was the only option other than surrender, especially since German pressure was intense on the Allied pocket, which was based on Dunkirk. The British troops therefore began to assemble on the beaches here for what was to become known as the Miracle of Dunkirk. Back in England, a large fleet of vessels ranging from destroyers through cross-channel ferries down to small pleasure craft had been hastily assembled. They began to make their way across the channel in order to take off the troops from the beaches. The evacuation began on the 27th of May. One German decision brought vital additional time for the evacuation. Hitler halted the German tanks because Hermann Goering had persuaded him to allow the Luftwaffe to finish off the Allied forces. Several vessels were sunk. RAF fighters based in southern England enabled the evacuation to continue. Eventually, though, with the beaches themselves now under artillery fire and ship sinkings increasing, the evacuation had to be halted on the 3rd of June. No less than 220,000 British and 120,000 French and Belgians had been rescued to enable them to fight another day. But they had to leave all their vehicles and heavy weapons behind, as well as many men who now faced a long period as prisoners of war. It had been a devastating defeat. But the Battle of France was not yet over, and there was more work to be done before the German troops could enjoy the fruits of victory. On the 5th of June, while Army Group C continued to tie down the Maginot defences, the Germans struck south across the rivers Somme and Aisne. As usual, the Luftwaffe prepared the ground. Initially, French resistance was fierce, and the Germans had to fight hard to break out of their bridgeheads. But soon they began to make progress. A trickle of surrendering French soon turned into a flood. The panzer columns raced ever onwards, with Paris now under threat. The French government declared it an open city on the 11th of June in order to avoid the devastation that had befallen Warsaw and Rotterdam. 4 days later, the Germans secured the prize that had so eluded them in 1914. Parisians could only watch, stunned. On the 16th of June, the French sought an armistice. By this time, the Germans had finally begun to attack the Maginot Line, which had been enveloped by the offensive from the north. The French defenders could do no more than offer token resistance. The Germans soon reduced the forts. They then occupied the Maginot Line. France's impregnable bastion had fallen. The French situation had been aggravated on the 10th of June, when Mussolini, who had stayed out of the conflict in spite of pressure from Hitler, declared war on Britain and France. 10 days later, expecting little or no opposition, his troops invaded southern France, but were surprised at the firm resistance they met and made little headway. Even though the British had had to evacuate their forces from France, they did try to send out another expeditionary force, this time to Cherbourg. But by the time this was organized, it included a Canadian division, and began to arrive at Cherbourg, it was too late, and it had to return to England. Even if it had been landed, the force was most unlikely to have made any difference to the outcome. It was too small and poorly equipped to have withheld the battle-hardened Germans for long. Winston Churchill, who had taken over as Prime Minister on the 10th of May, the day of the German invasion of the West, now realized that Britain would be Hitler's next target, and began to prepare accordingly. Across the English Channel on the 22nd of June 1940, the French were brought to the armistice table, which was in the very same railway carriage where the Germans had been made to sign the November 1918 armistice. It was the final indignity for the French, but a moment of supreme triumph for Hitler.